All right, today we are diving into one of the most unbelievable corporate scandals in history. The story of how telecom giant WorldCom built a mountain of lies and the spectacular crash that followed. And let's just start with this number, $11 billion. Now, that's not what the company was worth. No, that's the size of the lie. It's the amount of profit that WorldCom literally just made up out of thin air, pulling off the biggest accounting fraud of its time. So how on earth does a deception this massive even happen? Well, to get that, we need to rewind the clock. We're heading back to the late 1990s, right into the middle of the wild, crazy optimism of the dot-com boom. At that time, you gotta remember the internet was just exploding. It was the new frontier. Deregulation in the telecom industry created this total frenzy of competition. And investors, well, they looked at these companies like they were paving the digital highways of the future. The market didn't just want growth, it demanded it. Nonstop. And in that kind of superheated pressure cooker environment, any sign of slowing down was basically a death sentence for your stock. So for WorldCom, meeting Wall Street's crazy high expectations wasn't just a goal, it was all about survival. So what was WorldCom's answer to all this pressure? Well, they had a very direct and, let's be honest, a very aggressive strategy. They didn't just want to grow, they were aiming for what they called hypergrowth. Their playbook was brutally simple. If you can't build it fast enough, just buy it. WorldCom went on this massive shopping spree, gobbling up dozens of its competitors just to inflate its size and its revenue. They were literally buying their way to the top of the industry. And you know what? For a while, it worked like a charm. Wall Street absolutely loved it. The stock price shot up from just pennies to over $60 a share. On the surface, WorldCom looked like this unstoppable giant of the new economy. But here's the thing about a growth strategy that's all about acquisitions. Sooner or later, you run out of companies to buy. And when that growth engine started to sputter, the pressure from Wall Street didn't just go away. So WorldCom's executives found a new and deeply fraudulent way to keep the illusion of growth alive. Okay, to really understand the fraud, you have to get this one key term, line costs. For a company like WorldCom, this is a huge day-to-day expense. Think of it like paying rent for the network space they use. This one little concept, it's the key that unlocks the entire scandal. And here is the trick. It's so simple, it's brilliant. WorldCom took billions of dollars of these normal, everyday expenses and just pretended they were long-term investments. It's the difference between paying your rent every month, which obviously lowers your profit, versus buying the whole building, which you can count as an asset. It was a simple accounting trick that magically turned huge expenses into completely fake profits. So this was basically their two-pronged attack on reality. First, they capitalized their operating costs, just like we saw. But when even that wasn't enough to hit their numbers, they just started inventing revenue out of thin air, sticking it in these vague corporate accounts. It was unbelievably brazen. You know, a lie that big, a house of cards that high, it just can't stand forever. And when the truth about WorldCom finally started to leak, the whole thing came crashing down, and it was fast and it was brutal. But here's the wild part. This massive fraud wasn't uncovered by the SEC or some hotshot Wall Street analyst. Nope. The people who brought down this multi-billion-dollar house of cards, they worked right inside the company. It was a small, really persistent team of internal auditors. They just knew something was fundamentally wrong with the books, so they started digging, working late at night, in secret. They started pulling on this one little thread of a few $100 million and ended up unraveling the entire $11 billion lie. And this chart, it just lays the whole thing bare. In 2001, WorldCom told the world they made a profit of nearly $4 billion. The truth? They had actually lost over $500 million. The gap between the fiction they were selling and the reality was just insane. So once that internal audit team took their findings to the board, it was game over. In the summer of 2002, WorldCom had to admit what they'd been doing. Just a few weeks later, they filed for what was, at the time, the biggest bankruptcy in the history of the United States. The fall of WorldCom wasn't just some story in the business section. This was a national economic disaster, and the human cost was just devastating. The fallout from this literally changed the rules for corporate America forever. I mean, just look at the damage. Over 30,000 people lost their jobs, just like that. Investors, they lost an incredible $180 billion. This wasn't some victimless white-collar crime. This wiped out people's life savings, their retirement funds, their entire careers. And you have to remember, WorldCom didn't happen in a vacuum. It collapsed just months after another corporate giant, Enron, went down in flames. Now, their methods were different. Enron's fraud was super complex, while WorldCom's was almost shockingly simple. But the root cause, it was exactly the same, a toxic win-at-all-costs culture fueled by that relentless pressure for constant growth. So, from the wreckage of WorldCom and Enron, we were forced to learn some pretty painful but critical lessons. We learned that a growth-at-all-costs culture is a massive red flag. These scandals led directly to new laws, like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, that demanded independent oversight and held CEOs personally responsible for their numbers. And it proved, without a doubt, that a company's own internal auditors can be its most important defense against total disaster. Which leaves us with one final, kind of haunting question. This wasn't a small mistake. This was an $11 billion fraud that went on for years. So how did the board of directors, the very people whose entire job is to provide oversight, how did they miss it? That's a question that every single investor and board member should still be asking themselves today.